Sewing the dress of my dreams entirely by hand. Hi, my name is Maggie and welcome to another sewing video. Today we're attempting to make the perfect A-line dress entirely by hand, and I've had 2 meters of this gorgeous pink floral fabric for years now and I've never got to use it. So I was preparing to go ahead and draft a pattern. I decided to go with this Simplicity pattern that I already had, which is an 8-panel princess line dress. For reference, it's Simplicity 2917, which I found in a thrift shop once. According to the measurements on the pattern envelope, I'm a mixture of 3 separate sizes, which meant I had to combine several sizes to cut out my pattern. This is me just marking the new cutting lines onto the pattern before cutting out the paper. And this is also why you want to check your measurements before deciding on your size if you're using commercial patterns, because the measurements are not always the same. I also altered the sweetheart neckline on the original pattern to be a square neckline. Then I cut everything out of the fabric, and I was trying to be as economical as possible, so there was a little bit of puzzling involved with the pieces to get the most out of my fabric. And for lining, I'm using a heavyish cotton canvas, which in hindsight I might have used something a little bit softer, more flowy, but it really depends on the effect that you want to get, and the cotton canvas that I used worked alright as well. I'm beginning to assemble the dress by pinning the panels together and hand sewing the seams in place with a 1.5 cm seam allowance as the pattern requires. I'm trying to keep my stitches small and neat and straight, and I'm using a combination stitch, meaning 3 or 4 running stitches separated by a back stitch for extra strength. This is a historical sewing technique that was widely used before sewing machines were introduced, and I must say that although it took longer, the seams turned out really nice and firm and as strong as a machine sewn seam. Here's a picture of what the lining looks like, and since it's got enough ease to put on without needing a zipper, I closed all of the seams fully instead of leaving an opening for a closure. But that also means that I will need to make either a belt or a corset-like closure like you see on many cottagecore dresses these days to make the fit adapt to my figure. Because there were 16 full-length seams in total, this took me about 8 hours to do, but I listened to podcasts and videos while working, so I listened to podcasts and videos while working. It required a lot of patience, but I really loved the process, and I was so happy with how even and firm the seams came out. I feel it should be a mandatory part of education for everybody to sew at least one piece of clothing entirely by hand, start to finish, because doing that you realize for the first time just how valuable clothing actually is and how much work and time goes into the creation of a single piece of clothing. Imagine what that would do to the fast fashion industry. I sew quite a lot, but mostly by machine, so this was an eye-opening experience for me as well. I did hand sewing before, obviously, but never to this extent, and hand sewing also gave me the feeling of creating a work of art rather than producing a product, which was a really interesting experience, and I must say that I loved it. Then it was time to press all of the seams open and to trim the seam allowance down, as well as clip the seams at the curves, which I probably should have done before pressing, so that all of the seams lie flat. I'm clipping diagonally instead of at a right angle, so the seams don't start fraying as easily when they are put under stress. Please take a moment to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and like this video if you're enjoying it so far. The engagement would really help me out. I've also prepared a facing for the neckline and a binding for the armholes. There were facings included in the pattern, but for the front neckline I had to create my own since I had altered it. If you need to create your own facing, what you do is you simply trace the neckline. I pinned lining and dress fabric together at the neck and the armholes to make sure everything fits and is nice and secure, before pinning the facing to the right side of the dress, right sides facing. I sewed all around the neckline and then trimmed away the seam allowance from the dress neckline, but leaving the facing seam allowance intact. The curved part of the seam allowance was again clipped or snipped to reduce bulk and to help everything lie flat. Then I understitched the seam allowance to the lining, also by hand, using a large basting stitch or running stitch, but making sure to only catch the lining fabric and not stitching through both layers of fabric, so no stitches were visible on the outside. Then the facing was neatly folded over and the raw edge tucked under, making sure it was absolutely even all the way around. I sewed it in place using tiny felling stitches, and the idea here is that it looks like bias binding from the wrong side of the dress, so the dress will be reversible and I can wear it wrong side out. The hem was trimmed and also carefully folded and pinned in place and neatly sewn down, so there's an appearance of trim at the bottom hem of the garment as well. Seamstresses always used to say that you have to be able to wear a garment inside out, and that's what I'm going for in real life with this dress as well. I also created a little belt with this gold buckle that I had left from an old belt to go with the dress. One final press and the dress is finished. At about 8 p.m. the day before my birthday, so I really just finished in time. I'm really very happy with how the dress came out. I might have snatched the waistline a little bit more because there is really lots of ease, but wearing it either with a belt or a pin solves that problem, and I might even add some lacing later. It was a real adventure to really sew an entire piece of clothing 100% by hand. It took longer, but the perceived value of this finished dress is so much higher than the average machine sewn garment that I've made before, and the level of accuracy I was able to achieve is so much higher than usual as well. Yes, sewing by hand and sticking with it needs patience and perseverance, but it was a very relaxing process as well, and an experience I can recommend to everybody. Thank you so much for watching to the end, and I will see you in the next video.